You create your life with the stories you tell yourself. Want more fun, love, and money? Then write your new story and live into it. Louis DiBianco's podcast, Change Your Story, Change Your Life, shows you how to discover your empowering story. You'll meet many successful people who have created magnificent lives, even when the odds were stacked against them. Plus, you'll learn the secrets of great storytelling that can explode your business. And now, here is your host, Louis DiBianco.
One hot April afternoon in 2007, I was leading my platoon on a patrol in the streets of Baghdad when I was shot and killed by a sniper bullet. Those words are not from a fiction novel. They're from a life-changing book called The Beauty of a Darker Soul, written by the man who was shot and killed by that sniper bullet. How can that be? You're about to find out in the next few minutes, directly from the man who died. His story is like no other story you've ever heard. Hello, storytellers, and welcome to another episode of Change Your Story, Change Your Life. I'm your host, Louis DiBianco. I've discovered that leaders are readers. And as a listener to this show, you have access as a free gift to any audiobook of your choice, choosing from more than 180,000 titles from our sponsor, Audible. Just go to www.audibletrial.com/storypower, choose the book that you want, download it for free, enjoy it, and keep it forever. Also, you will get a 1-month free trial of all of Audible's service. I'm excited to announce that I have created brand new content for you. It is an additional episode, a short one, about 5 to 10 minutes long, and it will appear at least once a week. I call these episodes one-word stories. Each episode will focus on a word, a common word that we all use, but it may be charged with meanings that are affecting our lives in ways that we can't even imagine. Enjoy these episodes as mini shots of empowerment. Remember to keep your dialogue with the show alive. It enriches everyone. Send your responses, your comments, your requests to lousclub@gmail.com. That's LOUSCLUB@gmail.com. I'm excited to introduce Josh Mantz, professional speaker, author, and CEO of Darker Souls, a clinical training and leadership consulting company tailored to the behavioral health and medical industries. Mr. Mantz and his company specialize in helping people deal with trauma. Josh, welcome to Change Your Story, Change Your Life.
Louis, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Josh, the pleasure is mine. Today, we're not going to start at the beginning. Please describe what happened when you were shot.
The day we were shot, we've got some pretty strong reason to believe that it was an outside team that came in to hit us that day. Anyway, we got engaged by an enemy sniper that day. It was a complex ambush. And the bullet first severed the aorta of my senior non-commissioned officer, Staff Sergeant Marlon Harper, and then it ricocheted in my thigh and severed my femoral artery. So, for anyone who's watched movies like Black Hawk Down, there's a scene where one of the soldiers is kind of bleeding out on a table for hours and hours on end, and his artery is severed, and they're trying to capture that artery and pinch it off. That is precisely what happened to me in real life. And I went through a progression of a lot of really bizarre physiological symptoms But ultimately, again, being conscious through this whole experience was what I look back on now as being the beauty of it. I was able to witness my team just perform brilliantly, flawlessly in the face of absolute chaos. And the same for the medical team. When we got to the initial aid station, it like watching this medical team work, this trauma team, which I don't care if you're a military trauma team or your local ER, like, man, they're so forgotten about. and the level of heroism that goes on in an ER every single day is just something to reflect on, because those teams just come together and pull off these miracles. It was like watching a choreographed dance. In terms of how cohesively they worked together, how calm they stayed under pressure. But even despite that, I could feel myself starting to die.
Can you paint a picture of that moment for us?
Yeah, so going down to this last second or two, literally the point of transition from life to death. The only way that I can describe that is a moment of absolute and complete surrender to something much greater than ourselves, and through that surrender came an overwhelming sense of peace. It was like every positive, every negative, every good, every bad, all of it just vanished, and it was as if the spirit becomes part of everything and nothing at the same time. If there's ever an experience of feeling maybe like the absolute presence of God, or the pure moment in Eastern traditions of absolute pure awareness, right? Man, that would be it. It was a moment. There was no fear, there was no anger, there was no nothing. It was indescribable in many respects, and I consciously knew that I was dying, right? I flatlined for 15 minutes. I don't remember the 15 minutes, but then regained consciousness about 2 days later, and to learn that.
Well, here I don't want to just jump over that. You flatlined for 15 minutes. And I remember some important details in your book about that the attempts to revive someone when they flatlined, they usually give them up after how long?
Well, it kind of seems to shift and change more and more, but generally speaking, many doctors call it around the 6-minute mark, okay. Right? But because 6 minutes of being flatlined, no breathing, no pulse, is typically the point where catastrophic brain damage starts to set in. And so when I woke, when they put a pulse back on me, like if I woke up at all, they expected catastrophic brain damage. And when I woke up, there was no trace of it, not a trace.
Wow. I mean, 15 minutes, guys. I mean, listeners, you get that? Doctors say after 6 minutes, it's game over. Josh didn't just double that. He went 3 minutes beyond that to 15 and without brain damage. What were their reactions when they suddenly realized, oh my God, 15 minutes and he's still alive? Or not still alive, but we brought him back to life.
So one of the most powerful moments of my life was, long story short, but I ended up going back to Baghdad only about 4.5 months later after this. I was pulling staples out of my leg with a girl. I was stopping at nothing to get back to my team. But, I was fortunate to be able to do that. But the surprise for me when I got back to Baghdad is that medical team was still there. And, we set up a surprise visit to go. I had the opportunity to do something that few people ever get the opportunity to do. Thank the medical team that saved my life in person, in Baghdad, nonetheless. And I asked that brigade surgeon one question, and I was like, what possessed you guys to keep going for that long? And why? And without hesitating, he gave me a 3-word response. He said, "We never quit." And every time I tell that story today, it still gives me chills. Now, from a medical standpoint, as almost metaphysical as this is, right? There's the best way you can explain it on the medical side is that I flatlined while I was on the operating table, which was an advantage because they were able to start CPR and advanced cardio life support immediately. And that might have just kept enough blood running through the brain, enough oxygen to prevent that brain damage. But even that, it's still hard, Lewis, because I probably lost the majority of the blood in my body by the time I got there to begin with. So it was just absolutely heroic efforts on the medical team's part. Some of those details still continue to emerge. Just a couple months ago, after I released my books, one of those medics just read it and called me right away, and he said, I want to give you a little bit more detail. It was such a blessing of a conversation, as I found out that day that, I knew there was this guy named, this like 19-year-old former football player named Tipton. I always remembered him, right? He's the guy that I knew did CPR on me the entire time, right? You're talking 15 minutes of nonstop CPR, one guy doing it. And to anyone who's ever done live CPR before, like most people, even in the best of shape, are exhausted after 3 minutes. So he was able to fill in more details and just tell me how far Tipton actually went that day. Like there was some kind of, I was on basically a cot. This is a very rogue care facility with rudimentary equipment in the middle of Baghdad. And this cot, for some reason, was elevated too high, and they couldn't get it to adjust fast enough. So nobody could reach me except this guy named Tipton, who happened to be about 6'5", 260 pounds, former football player. And even then, he had to stand on a box, a crate, in order to get enough leverage to do it on me. And they just said that he refused to take even the slightest break. He was pouring sweat the whole time, and you can just imagine this just relentless effort from this team, and it's just, man, if anything embodies the power of the human spirit, it's moments like that.
Josh, thank you so much for sharing that. Now let's paint an early picture of you, the man who faced death and won. You're a decorated soldier who received the Purple Heart and Bronze Star with Valor while serving in combat in Iraq. Who are the two men who helped to shape who you are today?
Lewis, that goes all the way back to high school days. I'd say the two biggest influences on my life were my stepfather. My biological father died when I was very young. And my stepfather, who was a police officer most of his career, really had an enormous influence on me in terms of learning what it really meant to be involved in the service professions. And the second influence was a gentleman named Sergeant Major Doug Vanderpool, who is a retired Special Forces Sergeant Major, converted into one of my high school teachers after he retired. And he's the one that really taught me about many of the things that would be directly applicable in my career just a few years later, which is, more than anything else, appreciating the power of the human spirit.
Mm-hmm. What would you say were the most important life lessons that you got from each of these men?
From my stepfather, I had kind of a misunderstanding of who he was. I for the longest time, and kind of just thought of him as this kind of badass police officer who never lost a fight, and had this kind of misperception as a kid. And he was a very intimidating fellow. But when I started to do ride-alongs with him when I was a senior in high school and actually see him in action, it was the complete opposite. He resolves situations through empathy, through sympathy, through understanding, and without the use of force or violence or anything like that. And it completely changed the paradigm in terms of what's really important in handling these situations. Doug Vanderpool, the Special Forces Sergeant Major, he cultivated a deep interest in me in terms of the power of not only the human spirit, but the importance of humility, of understanding foreign cultures, of understanding the language. And this was just a couple years before 9/11. I mean, 2 years before 9/11. And the foreshadowing here couldn't be more profound, because it's those lessons, the power of language, the power of culture, the power of humility and empathy, that would drive everything that I would do post 9/11.
I read the book, and to my storytellers listening, it's a must-read book. It's gripping, better than watching most things on Netflix. And you will learn a lot about life from it. But what's interesting to me is that from reading the book and talking to you, I get this feeling that there are no accidents. Well, I've always believed that, but it was really driven home to me in the book, and that you were being groomed for a higher purpose through everything that happened to you, starting with meeting and being influenced by these two men. Now, you talk in your book about counterinsurgency. Can you tell us what that means, and what role did it play in your military life?
Great question. And it's such an important question because, culturally, and this isn't anyone's fault, really, but nor is this assigning any type of blame, but counterinsurgency is considered to be the graduate level of warfare because of its complexity. And it is the heart of it's the foundation of military operations today, practically worldwide, and definitely over the last 10 years or so. And the interesting thing is that many people, when they think of combat and war, they think of these, very conventional fights like World War II, where there's a clear-cut enemy and the force either comes home victorious or not, and just all the stigma surrounding that. And today it couldn't be farther from the truth. In today's age, like, certainly service members and soldiers must retain a phenomenal level of tactical expertise, and they have to be able to turn that switch on in a dime if they need to. And sometimes we do. But the heart of these operations, it's grounded in everything that I just mentioned: humility, empathy, relationship building. Success today depends on our ability to earn the trust of the local population and help them help themselves. And that's an incredibly complex, maddening at times task that people understand. Even in military and political channels, like it's not very well understood. So very complex environment that we're exposed to.
Well, I mean, I would imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, that the majority of the people who go over to fight would resist that idea. So
you're absolutely right. There's been a resistance to operating in this counterinsurgency environment, right? It is a war of paradoxes, and instead of, for example, if you and I are driving down the street in Baghdad and a roadside bomb goes off and that bomb kills me and you live, 9 times out of 10, your first reaction is going to be one of rage. It's going to be of fear. It's going to be of emotion. And your tendency is going to be to protect you and the rest of the force by firing back. But the problem is, in this environment, what are you firing back at? Maybe innocent people in a population that, where you don't understand their language or their culture. So that does more damage than good. And in today's age, we have to train very young people, 19, 20 years old, to suppress these incredible emotions of rage and not fire back. In a counterinsurgency environment, sometimes the best weapons do not shoot. And sometimes the best reaction is no action. And that is contrary to everything that soldiers were trained to do. It takes almost a transcendence of soul and spirit in order to be able to embody the values that it takes to successfully operate in that environment. Yet our service members had to learn how to do it on the fly over the last decade, and it was kind of an incredible process and journey that took a lot of reinsurance from a leadership perspective.
I certainly have never heard of that being applied, let's say, a lot anyway, in the Vietnam War.
So you're right. And the reason for that is it was a leadership failure. What's interesting about Vietnam should have been fought like a counterinsurgency. Westmoreland, the president, senior military and political leaders refused to fight that type of a war. They were caught in executing an algorithm of their past, right? The U.S. was kind of a victim of its own success. It was very successful in World War II. Conventional, overwhelming firepower. The industrial machine of the United States doing more was supposed to work, quote unquote, in Vietnam. And that led to a bunch of just endless carping bombings, endless casualties, right? And the refusal of the leadership to listen to the lower echelon leaders who were trying to activate counterinsurgency operations, right? And the U.S. kind of just swept Vietnam under the rug. They burned all the documents afterwards. They chalked that one up as a loss, right? And then suddenly in Desert Storm, they came back with this conventional firepower and just crushed it. Took out the fourth largest army in the world in a couple days. And once again, it kind of spawned this being a victim of their own success. They thought that conventional warfare was the answer. Fast forward to 9/11 in Iraq, and right after the initial invasion, right, a power vacuum ensued. Multiple different organizations started to step up to try to take power and undermine the existing government. And this is where all of these insurgencies spawned. So we were not prepared to fight this conflict. In fact, as Lieutenant Colonel John Nagel says in his book, he's very influential in the counterinsurgency world. Nagel was in a very unique position in his career, tied very closely to General Petraeus before Petraeus was in command over there. And what was interesting is Nagel, Petraeus, and a very small team of a couple other folks actually wrote this new counterinsurgency field manual because they knew that the need for it was there, that we were losing the war in Iraq, and we needed to take a completely different approach. But Secretary Rumsfeld was so adamantly against this counterinsurgency concept that he refused to allow that word to even be used.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
So it's a really interesting dynamic here. Like Petraeus and a very small team actually were almost running an internal insurgency against our own people so we could fight the right kind of war, preventing more casualties, which would ultimately prevent casualties, keep people safer on both sides. And, certainly, Bush replaced Rumsfeld with Gates, who was very counterinsurgency minded. Petraeus was sent in to save the day, which he did. And that kind of unlocked a lot of a completely new pathway in Iraq that unfortunately was a little bit too late for public interest to be maintained. But that's just a brief history of it.
Wow, that's fascinating. Josh, what is the Thayer method, and what role did it play in your development as a person and a soldier?
So the Thayer method is the academic technique that's taught at West Point, the United States Military Academy. And the interesting thing about West Point is they reverse the typical academic method. In most cases, the teacher instructs the material, and then you go back and you study it, and at some point you're tested. What happens at West Point is you're assigned all of the material beforehand. You have to internalize it and read it on your own. And then as soon as you set foot through the door of the classroom, you're tested on it. And it's only after the test that the teacher instructs the material. And the reason for that is over time, after 4 years of doing that, it teaches you how to think, not what to think. It teaches you how to pick up a manual of very complex information and learn it on your own, and to also be able to present it to other people to the best of your ability. So you don't really know or understand the effect that has on you when you're at West Point going through the process. But later in this counterinsurgency environment, this highly complex environment of the Middle East, we had to do a lot of figuring things out on our own. And, so that entire developmental process at the academy couldn't have been more profound.
Yeah, I get you, because basically it's teaching you self-responsibility. So you're not going to be just doing something by, let me look it up on page 35. No, let me respond to what's happening now and figure this out. Big difference.
Precisely.
Yeah. Why did you choose to study Arabic? And I understand you've developed quite a mastery of Arabic, yes?
Yeah, Arabic is a beast of a language, and fluency is a very fluid term, as you know, right? But throughout my career, I got pretty fluent by the end. But in short, 9/11 happened my freshman year at the academy. And, going back to those high school influences of Doug Vanderpool, I just instinctually knew the importance of language in terms of our ability to really inherently connect with people, to empathize with them, and to demonstrate respect for their culture. And, made the decision to major in Arabic because of that, right? I knew I was going into the infantry, so I knew I would be kind of people-facing. And as it turned out, Louis, that language is the most powerful weapon that I could have possibly carried in the Middle East. If I had to choose between, and this may sound crazy, but if I had to choose between carrying a weapon or knowing the Arabic language, I would take language every time. And
it doesn't sound crazy to me. I mean, look, my show is called Change Your Story, Change Your Life. And part of it is that I have always appreciated the incredible power of language. It creates emotion. It motivates people. It can lead, the old cliche is true. The pen is mightier than the sword. Because it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, look, Hitler used language to whip an entire nation into a monstrous frenzy and put into them beliefs that were horrific. And it was only after that the language had worked and the beliefs were there that then they were willing to pick up the guns and go and destroy people. But the language had to precede it.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm fascinated by this one. One of your teachers, Colonel Mark Conroe, taught you the Al-Fatiha? Is that how you pronounce it?
Al-Fatiha.
Al-Fatiha.
Stands for it means the opening.
Yes, it's the first passage of the Quran. And why did that teacher, teach it to you?
Yeah, so Mark was one of my primary Arabic instructors the entire way through the academy, and he was a foreign area officer in the Middle East. And this is a foreign area officers, very small community within the military of strategic-minded thinkers, successful officers, and who really have kind of a niche for this type of work. Very highly trained, and basically what the Foreign Area Officer does is they're a bridge between the foreign governments, their militaries, their political environments, and ours, right? And they facilitate this cooperative environment. So with his experience in the Middle East of doing that, he knew the importance of language, and any Foreign Area Officer will tell you that. They're all extensively trained in language. And Mark told us, like, very first year that learn Al-Fatiha verbatim, be able to recite it, because the level of respect that you'll earn by just demonstrating respect for their culture, for their religion, right? It will cut through any stigma that they have over Americans. It will cut through all those barriers and bust them down instantly. And I can't tell you how many times I have thrown out Al-Fatiha in the Middle East just to cut through that initial fear that many Iraqis would have towards us. It's scary. I mean, you got to empathize with them, right? I mean, think about what it would be like if the tables were turned, and people wearing full-blown SWAT gear and weapons and armor and tanks, and they're rolling up to your door. I mean that, and they can't speak your language, and you don't have the ability to communicate with them, right? So
no, it's powerful. I can imagine what you just said about reversing the role. Imagine a foreign soldier. You don't expect him to speak English. The guy opens his mouth, and what comes out is, let's say, the beginning of the Constitution of the United States, and he knows it. He knows it verbatim. I mean, that would change. Right. That would change something in the dynamic. Yeah,
it would at least sort of change the, it would lessen it, right? It would open a door and be able to facilitate this true human connection.
Yeah,
right.
Actually, better than that, better than the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence.
There you go. Right.
I mean, God, what is he saying? It's like, yeah, that's and hopefully the person is saying it so that you're aware that he's not mocking it. He's showing some respect to it. Could you just say the first few words of it, maybe the first line or two?
Yeah. It starts as a Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbi Alameen, right? And then there's probably another minute of language behind that I might butcher today because it's
what does that mean, what you just said?
In the name of God, most merciful, most mighty, is kind of basically the gist of how that starts, right? It's giving praise to God, right, in a way. And
that's beautiful. Your rules of engagement with counterinsurgency, where you used compassion and empathy as weapons of warfare, sometimes demanded that you put people's lives on the line in unexpected ways. Could you talk a bit about that?
For me in a leadership role, there were times where I had to put the lives of my team on the line, literally, for a t-shirt.
May I recount something that I remember from your book?
Oh, please.
Because it's in relation to this. You were talking about the day when one of your men forgot to bring the t-shirts, and you had to make a decision. Do I send these people back, this guy and some other soldiers back to get them? And the trip back to get them was on a very dangerous road that might have gotten them killed, or do we just continue without them? And you decided to send them to get the t-shirts, and getting them made all the difference in the world in creating a peaceful communication with people later on.
You paraphrase that perfectly, Louis. And that decision still haunts me to this day. It's decisions like that haunt me. The potentiality of what could have been.
Mm-hmm.
Those types of almost irresolvable moral, ethical dilemmas are prevalent almost on an everyday basis in that environment.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right on. Like that morning, like I'd been shaping up a relationship with the local police force, and they finally agreed. And this was a lot of Arabic talking to them. It was tons of trust building. It was weeks and weeks, probably months of effort leading up to it. And I finally got them to agree to go on a patrol with me, which that may sound like minuscule. Like, what are you talking about? The police should be going on patrol. Well, of course, but you got to remember these guys were not what we think of as a typical police force. Right? There is riddled with corruption. The police were not very well paid. They were not respected like the police force we have here. They couldn't even find fuel for their own vehicles sometimes. Right? So I mean, think of the irony of that. You're in one of the most oil-rich countries in the world, and their own police force can't even find gas for their cars because they can't afford it. Right? So, and anyone wearing a police uniform, if they weren't corrupt, they were a huge target for the insurgents. Right? So they were either crippled with fear or they were corrupt, and that's kind of where we were at that time. So for them to be able to join us for that patrol was a huge thing, and it's one that I couldn't screw up, right? And
right,
not just for us, but why was it so important? Because I needed to help those police gain back credibility, so that the Americans weren't over there for 20, 30 years, right? We need them to be the face of the operation. So that joint effort, when myself and the police were standing on the back of a truck bed handing out these shirts and school supplies, that has a very profound psychological impact on the community. And even though it's just barely nudging the ship in the right direction, that's the kind of thing that changes lives, right? That's the kind of thing that changes stories. So
I love it. Thanks for sharing that. Now, what is the significance of these words, "The streets will run red"? And what was your firsthand experience with their meaning?
Man, that is, of all the, there's you're reminding me here of just some of these stories that were captured, and sometimes I forget about them, even though they're in the book. Like this one is one of my probably most profound, most meaningful to me. There's this area called Obeidi, which was thought to be an extremely hostile, extremely dangerous area of Baghdad. It was in our area of responsibility, yet we hadn't progressed out that far yet, and we received a report one day from apparently Obeidi and their leadership that said, if the Americans walk through downtown Obeidi, the streets will run red with blood. So when I get information like that, and my team, we all kind of looked at each other and said, we need to go to Obeidi. Without hesitation, we were like, well, and it wasn't like trying to draw in a firefight or anything like that, but we needed to find out, one, if this was a credible threat, if it was real, or more importantly, find out what the tension was all about, right? And see if we could find ways to reduce that tension and rebuild that partnership. And that day, we approached that as probably the most planned out tactical operation that we've done in that entire deployment, because with that kind of a threat, we were leaning towards the fact that this could get very dangerous very quick, and almost going in with the expectation of a firefight. It's not what we wanted, but we prepared for that. And sure enough, getting there, I step out of the vehicle and we get all these hostile, confusing looks. Americans hadn't been there in years, and I just remember like that initial picture of this place. I see teenage kids standing knee deep in raw sewage, trying to fix their broken sewage systems. I see poverty everywhere. We get all these hostile looks, and sure enough, when I go past saying salam alaikum, right, and I start talking to them in their own language, all of those hostile looks instantaneously turned into smiles, right? And we walked right through the center of that city. Not a single drop of blood was spilled. In fact, it was the complete opposite. They were probably the nicest, most engaging Iraqis that I've met while over there. And again, it started to, from that point forward, we were able to cultivate that relationship and open up that area, largely because of the power of language.
Well, you know what's profound about this? I mean, let's take it out of the context of your experience in the war for a moment and just apply it to people's lives who might be listening to this today. It goes beyond language. It's the fact that the language you were using created an authentic rapport with the people you were talking to, so that they felt understood and perhaps appreciated. That is the secret behind true salesmanship.
Yep.
I mean, it's so powerful. I mean, you were seeing it in a context where it literally meant life or death, literally. But when people take it out of that context and they're saying, well, how do I learn how to get more sales?
Right.
Listen to some of this and apply it to your world, because it's still about people connecting first with other people. And they won't be open to what you're selling unless you've connected with them on an authentic level. Very powerful stuff.
And that's a very powerful analogy and summary. I couldn't agree with you more. Because it's all about relationships. It's about empathy, humility, and cultivating those kind of traits and values to drive true human connection, genuine relationships. I think it's arguably the most important thing in life.
You talk in your book about what you believe is humanity's greatest defense against evil. What is that in your mind?
In order to find the strength to trust in the good of people, right? In order to not stigmatize the entire local population and fall into that cognitive trap of believing that all of them are responsible for the violence that's happening over there. Our ability to trust in the inherent good of people is possibly our greatest defense.
Wow.
Against evil. And that's a very difficult thing to do, right? It takes a lot of moral and ethical courage to do that when a very small percentage of insurgents, and I mean maybe 5% of that population, are the violent extremists that drive all of these problems, right? It's the ability to be able to resist wrapping everyone in Iraq, everyone in the Middle East up into the category of those 5%, right? But because 90% of the people in this world, I don't care what country you're in, where you are in the world, people are just people, right? Mm-hmm. They want to live their lives without the threat of their kids being, injured or wounded by a mortar round going off when they're playing soccer. They don't want to pick up arms. They don't want to be violent. The majority of the people over there who did participate in the insurgency were coerced, strongly coerced into doing. You're talking. Remember, insurgents don't play by the rules. And they do the most horrific things. They rape, they torture, they kidnap, they kill. They have burned little children alive in ovens just to terrorize the local population into complying with them, right? And that fear, right? Most people over there do what they do just out of self-preservation, right? Just out of desperation. And over time, as that counterinsurgent force is able to secure the population and prevent the insurgents from being able to do things like that, that is what progressively over time builds that trust and allows that population to kind of come back to who they really are. But when you're it's it's easier said than done, especially when you're young and you might not understand the strategic implications of everything. It's hard when people around you, your best friends, are getting killed, when you're putting your life on the line for your families and their spouses and their kids are at stake, right? There's this tension between self-preservation and the preservation of my team versus that extreme sense of selflessness towards a far greater population of whom we don't even really know. So it's the why behind this has to be crystal clear and internalized. And that's what is it's a process to get to that.
Josh, I just had an idea. I want to suggest that instead of covering your second life, your life that began after you were revived, which we were going to do on this podcast, that we save that and that we do a follow-up interview very soon and share those valuable lessons and insights with our listeners. What do you think?
I'd be honored to do that. This is, I do a lot of interviews and speaking. I'm always happy to do it, but I really appreciate where this conversation went and your insight into it. And that's kind of what I love about the spontaneity of this and bringing your perspective to the table here. I think is going to pull a lot of great stuff out next round.
Thank you. We're not done. One of the things that really struck me when I read your description of that moment before you died, where there was surrender, no fear, a sense of peace. You even used the word, you said you felt safe, and you said that in the book. What struck me was everything I've read about mysticism. The mystics train themselves, or they develop the discipline to experience that mystical, what they call union with God. And that union with God is what you have just described as dying. And then I thought about how many people think about sex this way. Why is sex such a powerful force? Why do people even endanger themselves and their reputations for a moment of sexual ecstasy?
Right.
What is sexual ecstasy? If it's complete, it's not different from what you're describing. It's a moment of transcendence of self, in a moment of rapture, losing oneself, therefore dying.
Brother, that was so well said. In fact, it is a sense of dying, right? And I'll tell you that the emotional journey after this experience, right? And it sounds so positive right now, what I just described, but let's remember that for me, there was a 10-year journey of learning what that meant, what to do with that, how to integrate it into my current life. And this is kind of where we stem into this trauma discussion, right? What I experienced there was, and what we're talking about here, the mysticism, right? It's a peak experience.
Right.
And a peak experience is something that can punch through the current narrative of the world that we have. And each of ours is a little bit different, right, based on how we're raised. But we have these constructs of what we believe the world is and how it should work. And when these peak experiences happen, they can bust us through. It can broaden our emotional bandwidth and our cognitive, right? It can give us this new level of spirit and transcendence. Certainly, a near-death experience can prompt that, right? The mysticism and certain religious rituals can prompt it. Certain psychedelic experiences can do it, like dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, also happens to be endogenously produced within our own brains. which is a whole other talk. You've got rites of passage, right? Like these extreme events that we still see in tribal communities and certain places in culture, right? Dream states, certain dreams, when you can learn to pay attention to them, when you learn how to unlock their meaning, right? And I'm not talking about foo-foo stuff. We could get into what I really mean about dream work sometime, but I have had dreams that were as powerful as the near-death experience in terms of the way that I view life. Not many, but some, right?
Now, to my thank you for that. To my listeners, what I want you to think about is this. Josh just experienced, he was shot. He died. He literally died. And he experienced something that was transcendent and a form of ecstasy in a way.
Yeah.
Now, you think about that and ask yourself the question, what were the consequences for him after he regained consciousness and came back fully to life? And how did those consequences play out in the next 10 years of his life? And you won't find out until the next interview. We're not going to give it away. Now, but to arouse even a little more interest, perhaps, and curiosity, who was Fearless Marlon, and what did he tell you?
So Marlon Harper was the soldier who was shot by the same bullet that I was. It severed Marlon's aorta. Marlon ended up dying, unfortunately. But Marlon was not a couple weeks before that. Like I met Marlon a couple months prior, and one thing I noticed about Marlon and the reputation he had. First, he was the most respected soldier in that unit, the most experienced. He essentially raised everybody, and he was kind of that archetypal image of what a non-commissioned officer should be. But he was fearless, right? He was on his 6th deployment, and our biggest threat by far was roadside bombs. We got hit with roadside bombs almost every day, and just violent things that could. You get exposed to one of those, and you know what I mean. It will throw a 20-ton vehicle off the road, and you're talking something the size of a cinder block. And it's Marlon had no fear of roadside bombs. Like, he would actually get out and walk right up to him, thinking, if there was a suspected roadside bomb, he'd walk up and kick it. He'd be like, "No, we're good," and just had this incredible intuition that he fully trusted. But when it came to sniper attacks and sniper threats, Marlon turned into a different person, and he almost shut down. And one night so no fear of our primary threat, but sniper attacks, which were far, far less prevalent, far less of a threat, far less common. Marlon was petrified of them. And one night I asked him about that, not a few weeks before I was killed. And I said, "So Marlon, what's up with you and roadside bombs, man? Why are you fearless? Why do you act like this?" And he just sits back in his chair and he smiles, and he turns to me and says, "I already got my calling, sir, and it's not a roadside bomb." And then he turned back to his computer and kept working. And it was such a spooky moment. I got chills that I didn't even want to ask him anymore. It was one of those things where you just have to take it in. And then sure enough, killed a couple weeks later by a sniper. And I have to wonder if there was some sort of premonition there.
It's powerful, man. I already got my calling.
Yep.
Wow. What gets even spookier is that you put a tattoo on your arm. And what did that tattoo say?
Yeah, I had, ironically, before I was shot, I had this tattoo put on my arm that basically was a line from a poem. of a poem that I read when I was over there, and it was a poem written by a prisoner of war who basically was really struggling during captivity with the concept of God and faith, and he wrote this poem as a tribute to Ares, the god of war. And one of the lines is, "Thou need not swerve the bullet." And I originally being 22 years old, I kind of got that tattooed on my arm because it sounded kind of pretty bravado, right? It's like, yeah, just bring it, we don't need to swerve the bullet. And sure enough, I get tagged by this sniper not a month later. So, moral of the story there is don't tempt the war gods. They're probably real.
And you were asking them to visit you with the words, "Thou need not swerve the bullet," tattooed on your arm. Josh, what final words can you leave our listeners with to whet their appetite for the topic of our next interview, your second life after you conquered death?
I had to learn to accept the death of my old self before I could fully live in the present moment.
Whoa, I love that. Thank you. One last thing. How can people contact you?
Best way is www.darkersouls.com.
Thank you so much, Josh.
Hey, thank you, Liz. It was a pleasure. This was great.
And thank you, storytellers, for spending this very special time today with me and Josh Mantz. I consider myself privileged and honored to have met Josh and to hear his story, to have him share the intimate details of a story that is so rare, that is so far beyond anything that we normally hear in the course of our day, in the course of our lives, and to be able to take meaningful lessons from his words, from his story, and allow them to enrich me, you allow them to enrich you, and then collectively for us to take this message out into the world, or what we receive from this message out into the world, and enrich the lives of others. Please pay this forward. Let your friends and other people know that they can hear this on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, TuneIn Radio, and at the website changeyourstorypodcast.com. Always remember that there's a free gift waiting for you at that website. It's a downloadable free ebook entitled Storytelling Secrets for a Rich Life and Business. Josh, obviously covered so much ground, went into such profound places in the human experience that we can reflect on many, many different things. But I think you'll agree that one of the core messages, in fact, the core message that has informed his life, that actually helped to save his life numerous times, and that probably contributed to his experience of coming back from death, that core message is to approach everyone in the world with a sense of openness, compassion, understanding, and trust, and to put aside the stories that we've been given that are powerful judgments, that are prejudices about other people, and to be willing to start with this in mind, that everyone has an essence of good in them, that at the core, all human beings are good, that at the core, all human beings want peace. They want good things for themselves and others. And of course, Josh did that in circumstances that for some would be impossible. He did it in an environment where he was facing what has been defined as the enemy. He brought compassion, understanding, a sense of empathy, and that profoundly affected his life, his death and subsequent rebirth, and the life that he lives today. Talking about the life that he lives today, in a few weeks, I'll be interviewing Josh again, and you won't want to miss that second part of his story that is literally about his second life. And no matter what you're imagining, I'm sure that you're going to discover things there that you never expected about his journey back and the person that he created, the story that he created and that he's now living into in the world. In the next week, consider this. Look into your own life. Are there areas where you still hold very strong judgments that you very rarely, if ever, question? Judgments about other people that are powerful, that are negative? Be willing to put them aside, to do as they say, to have a beginner's mind, an innocence, a trust. And to help you do that, start by asking, how can I change my story and change my life?
Tune in to the next episode of Louis DiBianco's podcast. Become unstoppable as you learn to change your story, change your life.